my name's Simon, and I actually work for Blackmagic, but in a previous life, I worked for Brian and Rory at Soho Editors for 7 years. Wow, 7 years. So what I'm going to show you today is I'm just going to take you through a little bit of grading in Resolve. And also what I'm going to do is, as well as a little bit of an overview, I'm going to just show you some of the new features we've added in there that's just designed to sort of speed up your workflow. So yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take you through Resolve and again, how it integrates with Final Cut 10. From sort of the very beginning of the early stages of Final Cut Pro 10, Blackmagic have worked with Apple to make the workflow, the XML input and output workflow, as seamless as possible. And we like to think now we've got it sort of pretty much nailed down. So obviously when you are coming out of Final Cut Pro 10, you can simply export an XML. And then, when you open Resolve, this is what you'll be faced with. For those of you who are new to Resolve, the interface is actually split up into sort of several windows. I'm going to be concentrating, obviously, on the color page down here. But you also have a media pool. Now, the media pool is where you can simply import all your media. Or if you're doing an XML round trip from Final Cut 10, you can get Resolve to import the media for you. So this is very straightforward. So if I right-click in the media pool, I do have an option under timelines to say import, and I can choose to import an XML. So here we go. There's my XML from Final Cut 10. And if I open this, Resolve will say, okay, this is the name of the imported timeline. This is my time, my timeline name, the start time code. And I've also got an option that says automatically import source clips into media pool. Now, sometimes if the XML is being stored with the actual stored files, Resolve will pick them up straight away. But if that's not the case, it will sometimes give you this message to say, I actually can't find the clips. So all you've got to do is say, do you want to select from another folder? And I will hit yes. And it will give me an option to say, okay, where would you like to search for this media? Admittedly, what I've done in Resolve is I've just set up a shortcut to my media on my desktop. So this media is actually, as you can see, it's on this machine's desktop. So if I hit OK now, as you can see, it will generate a timeline. And now if I dive into my color page, there are all my clips in the color page. Now, for those of you new to Resolve, by default, the color page is split into 7 different windows. I have a gallery window, top left, which allows you to save your grades. I have a viewer in the middle window. I have a node window on the right-hand side, which again is something I will mention fairly shortly. I have my clips that run through the middle here, so any clip that is on my timeline will show up in here. And then the windows down the bottom, funnily enough, we don't really have a name for them. They're just called left, middle, and right, inspiringly. And these are all my color controls. So as you can see, now if I hit the space bar, I can play through. I can still use JKL in the color page as well, so I can sort of scrub through my timeline quite easily. The one thing I'm just going to mention at this point, and it's something that comes up all the time. The beauty of Resolve is you don't have to work in 4K, because a lot of people always think that the resolution you shoot in is the resolution you have to work in. Now, Resolve is very, very clever. Technically, it's resolution independent. So in Resolve, I can change my timeline resolution in my project settings in here, and Resolve will automatically scale the material. Even if I do things like tracking and power windows on it, even when I resize my timeline, it will remember the position and the size of the window and everything else. None of that changes. And for me, it's a really important thing, because what people try and do is they try and load everything into Resolve at sort of a massive resolution. And for example, if you've been using Final Cut 10 and you've used Resolve to create proxy files from RAWs, and then you're using the RAWs to grade, you don't have to work in Ultra HD. But then you're saying, but I have to export an Ultra HD file. All you then do is when you finish your grading, you change your timeline resolution from HD to Ultra HD, and then you render out. Said it's a common workflow for even for Soho post houses that have petabytes of storage in 8 GPU Linux boxes. They still work in lower resolutions because they don't have to work in 8K. So I always sort of point that out because it's kind of an important thing. Obviously, Resolve has always been known as a color corrector. And in 14, we've added a few tools that just kind of help speed up your color correction process. We've always had an auto grade in Resolve. So down here in the bottom, I just thought, is my zooming on? It is. It was all down here. We've always had an auto grade. So you can always auto balance a shot. But again, a lot of people, a lot of graders and a lot of new users to Resolve always went, but what I'd really like to do is I'd really like to be able to set a black point or set a white point or do a simple white balance. So for example, if I take a look at this shot here, it looks very, very yellow. So now what we've introduced, rather nattily, is a white balance tool. So quite simply, I can click on the white balance tool and then just simply zoom into my image. And I'm just going to click on that. Click on the snow, and hey presto, it's done a simple white balance. You'll also notice down here above my color wheels, I have these two targets, which is a set black and set white point. So for example, if I take a look at this clip here of the plane, I'm just going to zoom into this a little bit so you can actually see it. Again, I can actually say, well, I need a black point. So if I look at the guy's coat, it doesn't quite look as black as it should. So what I can do is set the black point and click, and also what I'm going to do is make things a touch dark, but then I can click and say set the white point on the snow. Now as you can see, sometimes it can get a little bit overzealous, but this is where obviously you have your color wheels. So are you all familiar with color wheels? I know some of you, if you're from a Final Cut 10 background, you may be used to using a color board, but I don't know, are you all familiar with color wheels? Yeah. So obviously I have lift, gamma, and gain that adjust the shadow. The lift adjusts the shadows, the gamma, the mids, and the gain, the highlights. And in Resolve, obviously the color wheels themselves adjust the hue and saturation of color in the luminance areas, and the sliders underneath adjust the actual brightness. So again, if I do a set black and set white point, and with this it can get a little bit overzealous. So again, if I just drag underneath my gain slider and drop this back down again, I can actually just drop that down. And now if I just toggle my node on and off, you can actually see the grade that I've just done. Now, what I've just mentioned there is nodes. So when you grade, you don't do everything all in one go. So I know in Final Cut Pro 10, you can add multiple color correctors to things. Think of a node like that. A node is one level of color correction, and you can build and add nodes to your grade. Now, nodes are quite clever, though, because you can start to do, and I'll show you this a little bit later, you can start to do quite clever things, because you can start to do things like bypass nodes. So if you do a heavy grade on something, but you just want to pick out an area and use the previous color, you can bypass a grade. So again, what I will do is I will actually show you that in a little while. So yeah, when I start to do a grade, I can actually start to build a grade using nodes. Now, traditional color correction, I can still do my traditional color correction. So in my right window down the bottom here, I do have my RGB parade. I can pop this window out, and as you can see, I can have a floating window. I can sort of adjust what scopes I see. So I can actually start to do a little bit of traditional correction on this shot. So if I look at my parade, you can see the black point and the white point of my parade sit well off. So the luminance, the shadows sit well off the bottom of the graph, and the highlights sit well off the top, which means the contrast in the shot isn't wonderful. So what I can do is my lift slider, if I just simply drag this down, as you can see, I'm just going to get it so the parade doesn't quite touch the bottom line. And again, I'm just going to push the gain up a little bit. Now what I've done is I've set those levels. Now if you want to sort of do any more contrast adjustment and you don't want to go beyond those points, you can always start to tweak the gamma. but also you have some controls underneath the color wheels, and one of these is contrast. So what the color wheels allow you to do, they allow you to do a balance with your contrast. And now using this contrast point, can you see I can tweak the contrast further? But can you see if I push the contrast up, it doesn't go sort of beyond the points that I've set. It creeps up a little bit, but it's not going way beyond. So I'm not clipping my shadows and my highlights. So as you can see, if you want to sort of add a little bit more contrast into the shot, I can push the contrast up and then adjust the pivot point. Because obviously if I do that second, if I push contrast, as you can see, I can maybe make some areas dark, but if I adjust the pivot point, you can adjust sort of where that contrast sits, so I can adjust the pivot. Again, also looking at this, now I've adjusted the contrast, you can just see in the highlights, if I look at the color of the snow, it looks a little bit yellow, and again, I can see that in my parades. If I look at the top of the graph here, you can see the blue graph is slightly lower than the red and the green, so with the gain, I can just push a touch more blue into it. So that is, obviously, you guys have probably used sort of very similar techniques like that before to balance a shot. So as well as doing sort of a white balance and setting my black and white point or using an autograde, I can use my wheels to simply balance the color and contrast in a shot. People often ask, in Resolve, you have such things as primary bars. Now, the primary bars roughly do what the color wheels do. If, for example, I had a shot with a lot of green in it. So, as you can see with this, actually, there's more green and red in the shadows. So what I could do with this, as you can see at the bottom of this graph, the blue graph sits lower than the green and the red, which means I've got less blue in the shadows. So again, if I just wanted to add blue in the shadows, I can just click on the primary bars and push those up a touch. So the primary bars work like the primary wheels, but you're sort of affecting individual color channels. But obviously, color is sort of an additive process. So if I push blue up, if I keep pushing blue up, it'll continue to push up, and therefore the green and the red will start to get lower. Likewise, if I pull the blue down on the left, you'll see what happens if I pull the blue down. You can now start to see slowly the green and red graphs start to push up. So, in essence, with the color bars, you're in essence doing the same control with the color wheels. It's just a different interface. This was the original sort of traditional Resolve interface of grading. The final sort of curveball is a lot of people ask, well, what are the logs? Because you've got shadow, midtone, highlights in log. Now, this, I don't have any sort of really proper log clips, but log works with logarithmic gamma curves. So if you shoot things in RAW, they have a very, very, not compressed, but with the logarithmic gamma curve, when you import them in, they look very flat. And then if you adapt the color space to, say, Rec. 709 or P3 for cinema delivery, your highlights and shadows go way out of whack. But when you're dealing with a really, really wide luminance range, as you will in a log file, if you start to just, yank the highlights down, so if you start to pull the gain down, with this if you start to pull the gain down, you'll actually start to darken the image. What a log setting will do is it just allows you to pull the very top of the luminance back into the range. So you end up affecting the very top of the highlights and the very bottom of the shadows. Admittedly, I don't know many graders that use it for midtone. Once you've started to build your grades, so, for example, here I've started to build my grades, I can now start to do things like secondary grading. And secondary grading is sort of applying looks, isolating certain areas of the image. So if I start to apply nodes to certain things, I can start to build my grade. So if I go back to the shot of my plane here, I want to add a node. So again, I can right-click and say add node, add serial. And a standard node is just a serial node. And now what I can start to do with this, I can start to adjust areas of the image. I can start to apply a look. So I like curves. The curve wheels are very good. With the curves, once you've set your contrast, you've got a huge amount of curves that will allow you to do different things. So the sort of custom curves will allow you to sort of sculpt your contrast within the shot a little bit more. So, for example, what I want to do is if I want to sculpt my midtones a little bit more, as you can see, I can sort of push the midtones up. So this area of snow, if I want this to just be, look, a little bit whiter than it actually is, I can just use the curves. And again, the curves are great because once you set your luminance levels, you're kind of adjusting the contrast within the levels that you've set. Another curve that I use an awful lot, and this is really good, is something called a hue versus saturation curve. Now, what a lot of people are tempted to do in Resolve is when you have a color like this on screen and you want to make it brighter, the first tool that the people reach for is the qualifier. Now, the qualifier is great, and again, I'll show you a little bit of the qualifier and how that works. The qualifier is great, but the issue you have with the qualifier is you've got to get your selection absolutely spot on, because if not, you can see noise in your selection, and it takes you a while to adjust. So things like the hue versus saturation curve is really good, because in this shot in here, I've got a red plane. It's red. I don't have to qualify it. All I can do in Resolve is if I hit the red option down here, as you can see, it gives me a red point. And what I can do is if I just push the red color up in here, you can see I'm just adjusting the red in the shot. I use these curves all the time just to boost sort of little bits of saturation of color, because it can be quite subtle. Even though, for example, if I use a shot like this where I've got a series of colors, I'm just going to grade that a little bit more. So for example, if I take a look at this shot, you can see I've got like quite a lot of blues, quite a lot of greens in it. So again, I can do a blue point and just say, you know what, I just want to push the blues up. Also, there's quite a lot of cyan in here, so I can put a cyan point in and just push those up as well. And as you can see, I can start to just push the colors up in the shot. So the curves actually are great. They allow you to just start to pick color, sort of just enhance colors in your shot. You can do individual color picks. I'm just going to brighten that shot up a little bit. So with the curves, what I can actually do is I can actually pick sort of the color of the water, and as you can see, it will do it'll put a point on my hue v sat, and as you can see, I can start to push that up. But I don't know if you can see that, it starts to look a little bit noisy, because again, it's kind of working like a qualifier, because it's only picking one specific color. So if you pick a range of colors like a blue or a cyan, it's really easy to use the curves to push the colors in those shots. As I said, I mentioned the qualifier as well. So again, the qualifier, we've always had a hue, saturation, and a luminance qualifier. So for example, I'm just going to add a serial node to this. For example, if I wanted to pick the color of these trees, the yellow color in these trees here, obviously with my qualifier, I can select the color. And then if I turn on my highlight, as you can see with an HSL qualifier, I can just click on a color and it will select it. Now, we actually have several different types of qualifier. Not many people actually know this. Again, people I've been speaking to at the show have actually gone, I didn't realize there were other qualifiers that you have. And dare I say, you have the lazy person's qualifier that I really like. So under my qualifiers in here, under my HSL, I have something called a 3D qualifier. Now the 3D qualifier is great. It's kind of a bit like the Magic Wand tool in Photoshop. So I can just simply drag over a selection like so. And again, if I turn my highlight off, you can see the selection path that I've done. So as you can see, it's really quick and easy just to select colors in a shot just by dragging over them. And then once they're dragged over again, I can just start to clean my mat up a little bit. I think I've got a lot, yeah, that might do. And so then, I can start to then just push the saturation point in that. So as you can see, I can just sort of start to push the sat in the plane. So the 3D qualifier is really good. Now, one thing I really do want to touch on is our OpenFX. So in Resolve 14, we have a series of new effects that again help to speed up your color correction. So my qualify that I did there, as you can see, I've sort of qualified the sort of green in the trees. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to widen that out so it sort of includes a lot more color in there. Now again, a lot of things that people say is like, if I have the trees like this, I want to make them all one shade of green. Now you could use to do this, you could use the selection and then use the color wheels to try and match it. But now with our new sort of OpenFX, I have something called a color compressor. So I can just drag and drop this onto the node where I've used the qualifier. And then in my target color, I can just say, right, go and pick the color of the trees. And now if I say compress hue, do the compress saturation, I can start to make the trees all the same color. And it's just little things, these open effects are just little things like that that we've added to help speed up your grading. The coolest one that we've done is something you may have seen. It's called a face refinement tool. One of the biggest feature requests we get is for doing beauty work, for retouching faces, for just smoothing people's skin. And don't get me wrong, you can use power windows and tracking to do this. But in our open effect, this is the face refinement tool. I'm going to point this out. This is a studio-only version. So the free version of Resolve will let you test this, but it'll watermark it. Yeah, we've got to pay the bills somehow. So if I drag and drop the face refinement onto this shot, now if I analyze it, it will look for the features of the face. So it will do facial tracking of sort of jawline, mouth, nose, eyes, eyebrows. So what Resolve has done here is it's tracked this shot and it actually knows where the features of the face are. So what I can do is in my effect here, if I turn off the show overlay option, you can see I have such things as smoothing and detail size. So for example, if I start to smooth, you can see I can start to soften his facial features. Again, what I might just do is add a little bit more detail back into this so he doesn't look quite as polished. And again, I can then up the contrast, just put a little bit more shading on his face. But then the very, very clever thing with this, because it's done facial recognition, it knows where the rest of the features are. So for example, eye retouching. His eyes are a bit dark, so I'm just going to brighten them slightly. And the effect has sort of blurred them. So if I do a little bit of sharpening, I can sharpen his eyes. Everybody's favorite, the eye bag removal, will remove eye bags from under his eyes. And hopefully we'll test this Mac out. I'm getting about 11 frames a second playback. So again, as I said, and I can go in and do everything on this. I've got color correction. So again, I can sort of grade his face if you like. So, if I want to make him slightly brighter or slightly darker, change the tint on him a touch. Don't want to make it, good, we've adjusted the tint tool, so make him a little bit more tan. And also things like shine removal. Shine removal, when you had shiny elements of the skin, they were always really, really difficult to get rid of, but now with the shine removal. So if I just full frame that. And as you can see, I don't have to do any tracking, I don't have to do any windows, it's all there. It's an unbelievable tool. As I said, this is a studio-only function. But dare I say now, Resolve Studio is 259 euros, as I was saying. And also as well, we've always had a dongle system. I don't know those of you, if you own Resolve Studio, used to come with a little dongle. You can now have an activation key. So you can now purchase an activation key, and as long as you're online, you can just put your activation key in, and it puts it onto 2 machines. So, things like the face refinement is great. So obviously, once you're finished grading, getting back into Final Cut 10 is straightforward as well. In the Deliver page, you can see up here in my render settings, at the moment it says Final Cut 7, but if I click on the drop-down menu, I have a Final Cut 10 option. And as you can see, this will automatically lock certain things down. So this thing here is the most important thing. It says individual clips, and it doesn't give you the option to change it. Because what happens with Resolve, when you render out, it understands that you're going back to Final Cut 10. So you don't want a flattened QuickTime movie. So what it does is it renders out the clips as individual clips with your grades on. As you can see, you can choose your codec down here. You can also choose your resolution. So if I scroll down, I can choose the resolution. And It will also generate a new XML. So if you import that XML back into Final Cut, it'll come in with your new graded clips. And obviously not everything translates from Final Cut 10 into Resolve. So text generators in Final Cut 10 are actually, as you guys know, they're motion templates. So we don't have a way of interpreting those. But when you take the XML back, the XML, when you sort of export out of Final Cut 10, it turns lots of things off that it doesn't understand. When you take the XML back in, it turns everything back on. So the workflow between Final Cut 10 and Resolve is getting quite seamless now. The resolution here is the resolution that the clips are going to be rendered out at. So again, yeah, in Resolve, if I've been working in HD, but you want your clips are actually Ultra HD, you can just change the resolution in here. And again, people often think if your timeline resolution is set to HD and then you choose to render out in Ultra HD, people think it's upscaling. It's not, it's just reading the raw files and putting. And, for example, just to show you an example of that with the resolution is, I was talking about changing the timeline settings. I'm working in HD here. If I change this to Ultra HD, you can see my face refinement is still exactly in the same place. It's not moved. And that's a really important thing. If I do individual clips under the advanced settings under here, if I click on advanced settings, if I scroll down, I have an option to add frame handles at the bottom. So again, yeah, if you go back into Final Cut and you think you might just need to do a little bit of trimming, again, if you've got transitions, Resolve understands you've got transitions because complex transitions will be interpreted as dissolves. Again, you can turn them off to render, but Resolve understands so it'll always render the handles, so your transitions are still there. But again, you have the option to add more frame handles if you need to. Thank you for having me, and thanks for listening.